This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of guys with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 294, Drutiny. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're joined by Josh Waihi to learn about Drutiny, a command line Drupal audit tool that he created in the past 4 or 5 years. Good evening. I'm Nick Laughlin. Joining us, as I mentioned, is Josh Waihi. He's the director of digital consulting at Acquia. He lives in Wellington, New Zealand, which is why we're recording a little bit later than usual. And welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Also joining us, as usual, Stephen Cross with Parallax Info Technology. What's new with you this week?
Hey, thanks for joining us, Josh. Nice to see you, Nick. What's new with me this week is we have a lot less people on the show. So John is out this week, and we're supposed to have our first guest host week with Fatima. She'll be joining us next week. So we have a lighthouse tonight, which is good. Nick and I can take all the questions ourselves. So my update this week is totally non-technical, but I don't know if anyone watches Barstool Pizza Reviews on YouTube. Anyone ever heard of it?
I've heard of Barstool. I've never seen
it is the same. It's the same guy who runs Barstool Sports, and he does these pizza reviews all over the country, maybe the world, where he goes into a pizza place, gets a pizza pie, takes one bite, and gives a review. And he's got like 500,000 followers on YouTube. And I started watching it a year ago, and I'd never missed one of his pizza reviews. I don't even eat pizza very often. They're just fantastic to watch. And he had a big milestone this week is he finally rated someone that I've ever seen over a 9. So someone got a 9.1 on his pizza scale. So it was pretty exciting. It's a fantastic, if you like pizza, check out Barstool Pizza Review.
I'll have to check it out. I've never heard of it, but I'm a fan of strange, interesting little video series like that. What's new with you this week, Josh?
As a director at Acquia, I don't get a whole lot of time in front of text editors or command line interfaces anymore. But this week I got to solve a customer problem that I was kind of happy about. They had just eating up all of this memory on the server, and then just out of memorying the server. And there was no idea why. There's no traffic going to the website that hadn't even gone live yet. And it was what it turned out to be was that they were using one of Symfony's recursive directory capabilities to scan for files, and it was I don't know, they must have set it to scan the root system or something, because it was just getting the entire list or traversing a symlink recursively and just bloating out the memory. The thing was it was running on the command line. They didn't have logging set up, so we couldn't see it. The only thing that gave it away was that they had an exception trigger that wasn't correctly namespaced. And so it was creating a fatal error because PHP couldn't find the class of the exception, and it was pumping out into syslog. And so we were it was literally looking at the graphs that show the time that the memory spikes, and it aligned perfectly to when this fatal error occurred. And that was the only thing that gave it away. It was the one time that a poor development mistake actually was useful.
I mean, those types of detective situations are always satisfying when you solve them.
Yeah,
definitely.
So Nick, what's new with you this week?
I mean, this week, not too much. It was a quiet week. My update this week is for the people on camera. Is I got the new shirt that Mike mentioned last week or the week before. So I got the new Talking Drupal shirt. It's got I think it's a screen printed logo. It's got the name on the back.
Yep.
Can't really look at the camera when I'm turning my back, so I don't know if you can see that. I heard you say yep, so I assume you could. Yep. But yeah, it's been a quiet week gearing up on a couple of projects. So looking forward to the nicer weather. That's about it. So our primary topic this week, as I mentioned, is Drutiny, which is a command line tool that I'm slightly ashamed to say I've never heard of. It's, there's, working in Drupal, trying to audit sites all the time. There's always, you're always looking for something new to take a look at. Josh, can you give us what the elevator pitch for Drutiny? What's its purpose? What does it do?
Yeah, sure. Like the way that I would think about Drutiny, at its core, it's an auditing engine, right? It's going to let you define a series of things that you can assess against what we would call a Drutiny, a target, which is typically a Drupal site, but it doesn't have to be. And the way that we kind of use it at Acquia, I guess, is we think about trying to automate our thought leadership and assessing our customers' sites for where that thought leadership is useful, right? So if they've got a problem with their site, we audit for that, and then we pair that with the thought leadership that would go with it. Think about like knowledge-based articles or like knowledge bases in general. So there's loads of sites out there for different companies that have their own knowledge-based portals, and you're going to sort of Google for a support article that someone in the support team is audited for. If you have an issue, like you have to know that you have an issue. You have to then know what that issue is about to be able to find that article. You then have to read the article, understand the article, and then apply the knowledge in that article to be able to do something about that. With Drutiny, it sort of reverses the order. So we're proactively looking for an issue that we know customers can experience. And if we find it, we can then tell them about it, why it's important, what they should do about it, and surface it to them through a report. And there's loads of sort of milestones in the customer's journey in adopting Acquia and Drupal where you want to look for different things and alert them about those things at different times. So the perfect example, which is perhaps where yourselves might have seen its primary use, would be like in a sort of go live, getting ready for launch kind of process where you want to do a site review of the site and make sure that it's ready for production, right? Because we know there are things that are good for Drupal sites in development, things that are good for Drupal sites in production. Turn off deval, turn on syslog, get rid of dblog, that sort of stuff. And so there are all of these sort of checklists, right, that you can work through manually to make sure your site's compliant. And Drutiny is just a way of automating all of that. So we already have that kind of content and configuration set up, and we just pull that all into a profile, and we can talk about some of these concepts shortly, and then audit the site against that profile or collection of policies.
So what was the driver behind creating it? You mentioned trying to create kind of this thought leadership, but was it was it just kind of a personal project you decided was helpful, or did somebody just say, hey, we need a tool for this, you should start trying to do that? Why did this get started?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a part of when I joined Acquia, I joined as a technical account manager. Technical account managers at Acquia, prior to joining Acquia, I was a developer, Drupal developer, right, and an architect. So it moved from being someone who was used to developing sites and very hands-on in the project to being someone who knew all of that stuff but couldn't touch the project, right? Not allowed to write code and deliver source code, and instead you sort of have to advise. So a lot of what you're doing is observing what teams are doing and helping them understand if they're doing things well or not. And so there's a lot of inspection as a TAM that goes on. And then you find as you work across multiple customers that you're inspecting the same things again and again. Now, as a developer, you know that if you're programming something again and again and again, you probably want to write a module for that. You probably want to write some sort of tool to automate that process. And so the same kind of conclusions came to me to be able to say, can we audit Drupal sites in a consistent fashion for the same things? And it just start off with really simple things like, let's make sure that the val module's turned off when you go into production. Writing watchdog logs to the database is a bad idea in production. So let's make sure that's turned off as well. Syslog should be turned on so that we can still see watchdog logs when you're in production. Okay. So those sorts of things were like, real obvious pieces. And so we just started writing ways of being able to do that. And then the other sort of side of being a technical account manager is you're not reporting into the tech lead or the Drupal team, development team necessarily, although you engage with them. You're really about trying to help the business understand the significance of what they're doing with Drupal and helping them make the right decisions that help achieve technical success. And so we spend a lot of time not only just understanding the right things to do technically, but how to communicate them to the business so that they will, or to the customer, right? So that they will be informed and make the good decisions. Why is it a good idea to turn off database log module? Why should I prioritize that over the features that I'm trying to get finished in my sprint? So, so we realized that auditing was one half of the equation, but the other half of the equation was sort of making it pretty, making the surfacing that information in a way that the customer could understand, and it was in a report that they could work with. So once we sort of like compiled these list of things that we wanted to assess for, and we were able to assign the content for, what should we say if it was a success? What should we say if it was a failure? What's the fix if it was a failure? Why do we care about this thing in the first place, right? Once we sort of figured out the content for those different fields, right, let's call them fields, then it was just a case of collecting all of that information into a report that made sense. If you've ever seen a Qualys scan or report, right, these are security scans where they just like DDoS your website with security tests, and then they come up with these big massive reports, and they have a kind of structure to them about what you're assessing, what the severity of it is, a description, evidence of that problem, and then they give you a summary at the very top about this many successes, this many failures, and here are the severity of things. And customers use that as a guide, right? Like they might say, for us, we need to address everything that's critical and high in this report, right? And so then that's their kind of governing guide. And so we kind of took the next step with Drutney to do a similar thing, especially in the site review, where we would like add a severity field to all of the different policies that we were assessing. Okay. And then kind of arrange the report in such a way so that the highest severity things float to the top, ordered at the top of the report, and then combined with that kind of content that helps them understand why they should be caring about those things and what they should do. It helps give great guidance to our customers. Kind of a final step on that, right, is I mentioned earlier, TAMs, they often need to inspect for the same thing multiple times across multiple customers. Another sort of unique attribute about the Drupal industry as well is that Drupal supports multi-site. So there's a scenario where you might need to like assess a whole array of sites underneath a common code base, and need to know that they're all functioning correctly. If you think about it from like a code reuse standpoint, let's say you have 100 modules and you have 100 sites. If you have one module used by one site in that code base, then it's kind of, it represents sort of like 1% of your total portfolio in terms of technical debt. And yet, if it's something that is poorly maintained by the community, it perhaps proposes a much larger risk to your business, right? Because or rather, at least a cost, right? It's going to have higher overheads to maintain proportionately to, say, a module that's used by 80% of your sites, right? So you want to kind of, if you're thinking about code base reuse and multi-site, you're thinking distribution, and you're thinking about using a collection of modules across multiple sites in a common way, right? Like solving this problem using this pattern and this set of modules is what you really want to achieve.
I kind of want to interject here and actually ask you, this is kind of a bit of a rabbit hole, but I'm curious. You mentioned like multi-sites, and that's definitely one of the strong suits of Drupal. And, I certainly did a lot of multi-sites in Drupal 7. I built custom homegrown distributions, Do you find that people in Drupal 8 are doing a lot of multi-sites at Acquia? Like, is it as prevalent as it was in Drupal 7? Because I've not done a whole lot of multi-sites in Drupal 8.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess Acquia has an entire product built for it, right? Site Factory. And so we definitely do have customers that are looking to do multi-site, and we also support that on our Acquia Cloud Enterprise or Cloud Platform solution as well. So we still see plenty of multi-site customers there. They're general use cases, right? You get like the retailers where the organization has bought a number of brands, and they're, you know, like and so they need a site per brand. And then you also have multi-location. So they have different countries that they offer those brands across. And so you need to have a site per country. So in those sort of scenarios, you need to have lots of different sites. Sometimes they are, the regions, for example, they might have their own budgets. They can go and use their own agencies, but they want them to deliver on the same Drupal platform. And so now you're talking about like different Drupal partners from around the world wanting to contribute to a common code base and deploy that. And you need a way to kind of, what's the rule set? What's the governance look like to make sure that they solve problems in a common way that is maintainable and manageable? And that's where Drutney can really help, because you can, one thing that we did with the Australian government is the fact that Drutney is an open source tool. We defined a set of checks that we want, that we thought were sensible from Acquia's perspective. Then the Australian government took the tool and they added additional set of checks that they felt were needed for the way they wanted to operate their platform. They have a platform called GovCMS. And so it's, government can go and get their own CMS, a Drupal, through this service. And so they would take that and then they would be able to push that out to the partners that those government entities were working with and say, like, don't bring the site to our platform until it passes the Drutiny report. And, rather than pushing that to Acquia and the TAM and saying, like, let's spend all that time inspecting, building a report and feeding it back to the partner, that would take weeks of like back and forth to kind of get the site right. Instead, we can just give them the tool and say to the partner, like, you guys have the power now to kind of know what's green and what's red and be able to assess that for yourselves. And it just sort of accelerate that delivery life cycle because they know what they should and shouldn't be doing that much quicker.
Right. Very good. Can you tell me a little bit about who's behind it and, when you created it? Is it largely something that you've maintained? Has the community kind of jumped in? Is there a team at Acquia that helps maintain it? How does that work?
Yeah, if I go back to the Git logs, I think actually I wasn't the one that originally wrote it. That was Sean Hamlin, who was a co-worker with me, and Sean and I worked together for a number of years. So he kind of wrote the core of Drutiny 1, and then I kind of got more heavily involved and rewrote it for the version 2 era of it. It ultimately was sort of driven from us just trying to do our role as a technical account manager work at Acquia. And then we started doing it, using it there and then sharing it with our team of technical account managers across the globe. And so we were really kind of using it quite predominantly there, and then also driving a sort of adoption with customers, like I mentioned, the GovCMS. And so we saw a bit of community engagement just as a byproduct of them being customers with Acquia. I think, Stephen, you mentioned there's a talk online of Sean and I presenting about Drutiny. So there was a time where we also took it out to the Drupal community and talked about it. Funny story about the naming convention. There's a bit of a side track here, tangent. It was originally called Site Audit, I think. And then I think we got some pushback from some folk in the Drupal community because there was already a Drupal module called Site Audit. Sean actually came up with the idea of putting Drupal and scrutiny together to get the name Drutiny. and that name's kind of stuck ever since. I did want to kind of like point out as well. So yeah, there are obviously other tools in the Drupal community that you can use other than Drutiny, like Drush tools and modules that you can install. We intentionally made the decision for Drutiny to be an outside-in auditing system. It doesn't require you to be a part of the Drupal code base. So even though it's a PHP project and it's installable with Composer, it wouldn't encourage you to add it to your Composer project with Drupal, because the one thing I'm pretty confident the dependencies won't line up, but it can be run as a standalone. So you have like two completely separate projects, right? Drutiny in one and Drupal in the other. And Drutiny can, you can target something local, but you can also target a Drupal site that's remote, which is how we do most of our inspections.
So it's similar to Drush in that aspect. You can include it directly in Drupal, or you can kind of have a global install.
And that's actually intentional, because Drutiny actually piggybacks on top of Drush in most cases. So Drutiny kind of got built around the time of Drush 8, which I would kind of say is like, in some ways, the heyday before, Composer kind of took away global site aliases and things like that. But it allowed us to just say, well, like Drush already captures SSH credentials and how to access the site. So let's not reinvent that. Let's just use what Drush is using. And so we just piggybacked over the top of that. At Acquia, we have internal tooling for accessing sites. And so we have, I made Drutiny abstracted so that you can add additional access layers. So, you can use Drush, or you can use Acquia's internal tooling. I built another one so that it can piggyback over the top of Acquia's cloud API to get you into the Drupal site. Okay. Which is obviously available publicly for folk. And it also opened up the pathway for other organizations to adopt other methods. And so, when Sean moved on to Amazee, he was able to take Drutiny with him, and they were able to build adoption for that tool into that platform as well.
I've had a little bit of experience with Drutiny, installed it, played with it a little bit. And I think there's some key concepts that you need to understand about the architecture to understand the power of it and what it can do. And you've mentioned some words already. You've mentioned policies and profiles. So maybe you could walk through some of the key concepts.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. And I know this is a podcast, and so it's not going to be easy for people to see, but since we put this up on YouTube as well, I'm going to bring up some slides to help visualize it. And then, we'll still talk about it as well. So hopefully it'll still kind of communicate.
Talking Drupal first. First time we did a screen share, 294 episodes.
It's awesome.
Always innovating.
Okay.
There we go.
So it started with this from the audit. So the audit is the PHP part. It's actually a class inside of Drutiny, a PHP class. So there's many of them. For everything that you want to audit, any kind of thing that you want to audit, you would write a PHP class for. So a good example of that would be to check if a module is enabled on your Drupal site. So that would be the sort of thing that you would write a PHP audit class for inside of Drutiny. What drives that audit class is a policy. A policy is actually an object, a data object. In Drutiny, the sort of de facto way that data object is stored is as a YAML file. And it includes things like messaging, like, what it is that you're auditing, and the description that you're going to say to the end user, the success message, the failure message, the remediation message, the warning message. And it's going to also contain the configuration. So if the policy was using, for example, this class that checked if a module was enabled, the sort of configuration it might provide to that audit class would be the module itself that they wanted to check was going to be enabled, right? So it would be make sure that the syslog module was enabled. So the configuration would be to provide a parameter called module with a value called syslog. And then, so that way you can have multiple policies running on top of a common class, right? So you can check for lots of different modules being enabled or disabled or whatever, and then you can utilize a common class for that. Once you've got a sort of library of policies built, the next step on from there is a profile. A profile could be thought of as a collection of policies, and you would think about a profile in a particular use case. So the way that we think about it at Acquia is what are all the different places in the customer's life cycle where we want to check for something, and then we create a profile especially for that. So we talked about one already that would be like a site audit or a launch readiness assessment sort of thing. Another point in the life cycle would be a load analysis. So customer does some load testing, and then we want to audit a period of time and utilization of the stack. And I just kind of gave away another data point there, right? Which is that we're not just looking into Drupal. Like I said, it's an outside-in tool. We can also inspect other things about that, that are a part of the Drupal sort of total solution. So, for the load analysis, we're actually looking over a time period of data, reporting data. So Acquia Cloud Stack Metrics, for example, we can look at log analysis and digest that kind of information and surface insights in the report through the other third-party systems that aren't necessarily Drupal directly. Once you've got this profile and this use case, one other thing to add about profiles is it defines the content for the report. So policies are just this list of policies you're going to audit, and they're going to display in the report in some sort of set order. But you can also provide some context in the report around, like, maybe sections that you might want to break things down into. Okay. Or, if you want to display summary tables or additional insider information in that report, you can provide that in the profile. Finally, Drutiny has drivers for exporting format. So, how do you want to format the profile or the report once it's been built? And so the most common one that we use at Acquia is HTML, but you can also export the thing into JSON. We can put it into Markdown. We built a driver to also support Zendesk Markdown, so we can put that output into our support desk. Once it's in HTML, you can quite easily put it into PDF format, and that was a real significant choice as well to make sure that we had the data available in lots of different formats. We've also just recently written export formats for CSV and for Domo, so that we can get this data into other parts of the business. I know the guys at GovCMS were exporting it into JSON and pushing it into Elasticsearch so that they could look at, a more holistic view of the portfolio of sites they were managing and look at the data and visualize it in different ways again still. And so that kind of formulates the entirety of the tool, audit, policy, profile, and then finally its output. That's kind of what the tool manages. And then how we plug it into our business is we think about the channel that we deliver that into. So by channel, I mean sometimes it's a TAM that provides a report to the customer. Other times it could be support that are providing an insight through a support ticket. Other times, again, it could be our professional services team providing some insights around, like, a load test engagement they're running or something like that. So there's lots of these different places where we're looking to plug it in. And in an organization like Acquia, where you have lots of different technical skills, like you've got a support team, a professional services team, technical account management team, and also solution architects, you want to make sure that you're all singing from the same songbook, right? You want to make sure that you when someone recommends that you should use this module, you don't want another side of the organization saying you shouldn't use this module. And so, being able to have this sort of database of thought leadership built inside Drutiny, and then all of us able to use the tool across the organization for different purposes, really helps us achieve that, right? And make sure that we have clear and consistent messaging to our customers.
So you have a list of, I'm thinking this in my head as, like, my profile is, and you have a couple other slides here too, but you have your profile is like your recipe, and your policies are your ingredients to make up that recipe that you're building to do these audits. Can you give us some ideas of the types of policies that Drutiny supports? And like, if you install Drutiny, what volume of these kinds of things do you get access to? How many policies are there for you? And how often do you think you have to build some yourself?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I kind of mentioned, Drutiny has this ability to inspect anything that you can really think of or figure out how to inspect. And most of the time it thinks about doing that remotely, right? So it doesn't depend on needing to be where Drupal is, for example, to operate. So it's like, when I might run a Drutiny report on a customer's production environment, but I do that from my laptop, and I'm going to be SSHing in to use Drush, or I'm going to be connecting to the cloud API to be able to talk to parts of the Acquia platform, or I could be looking at our log analysis tools. We've got connectors into Cloudflare. I mentioned Domo already. And so there's these sort of suite of plugins that plug into it, and then you can go in and then assess those things. What we found is some of these things are quite Acquia specific. For example, Acquia uses Sumo Logic as our log analysis tool, and that's available to me as a technical account manager, but not to our customers. And the queries that we would use to send to Sumo Logic over the API to get that data out, it's not queries that are going to be kind of reusable in the community, because it's only really applicable to Acquia. So it's not like information that is available publicly, because it's not particularly useful publicly. So it limits what people can do with the tool by themselves. But what we have been able to provide publicly are the things that work with Drupal sort of native, right? So the policies that will allow you to assess something inside of Drupal. So there's like a Drupal 8 sort of site review, security review, and it can inspect things like, are you using security headers on your HTTP responses, or are you using this type of module, that type of module, stuff that's quite straightforward to assess inside of the Drupal 8 context. What we find is when you start looking at what is good in production, it becomes a bit more opinionated and subjective. So what we find a lot of the time when we're writing these things and all these policies for Drutiny, that a lot of them are about opinions that Acquia has about how you would practice Drupal on the Acquia platform. And so again, it's like because these are opinionated views, they're not necessarily quite applicable for a community general use, but of course they're absolutely applicable for anybody who operates on the Acquia platform. So we've really I've kind of struggled with being able to provide a great library of content for people to have access to, although there is some available today. And like I mentioned, it's Drupal 8 and Drupal 7 audits that look for a variety of things, like things like modules being enabled or disabled. There's some configuration there around like checking caching's turned on, or you're using HSTS security headers, or there's some other things like looking for large files in your site's files directory that might not be cacheable or something like that. Again, that one in particular is specific to the Acquia platform. Anything over 10 megabytes not going to be sitting in varnish cache. And so we look for that in case customers have those sorts of assets that could cause problems later on.
Have you found yourself creating any policies that are content related, that look for a particular, I'm almost thinking of it like maybe some BHAT kind of stuff or something, where it's looking for content on pages and things like that. And could it be used for that?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote an audit just recently. So I built this sort of report that was like a service delivery report for customers. Yeah. And one of the sections of that was to review with the customer Acquia's end of life schedule for various software that we're operating, right? I didn't want to have to every month go and check what our end of life schedule was, and then pull that manually into a report. Yeah. We actually have that published on our docs site, right? And the customer knows this, but they want me to pull it into a report and give it to them rather than them go to the website and look at it themselves. So all I did was just write a simple HTTP audit that just, did a
scrape.
Did a scrape of that page. Use the DOM manipulator to XPath where the table was in the page, and then just pull that into the report, right? And so now problem solved. I can just continue to run this automated report and provide that information to the customer, and everybody's happy. So that one, we didn't really talk about this, but like policies and audits, they have this sort of success and failure outcome to them, but they can also just have this is just a data sort of outcome where there's no success or failure. It's just an insight. And so you can do those sorts of things. We were very clear not to, make Drutney start becoming a regression testing tool, let's say. Like we talked about, could we pull this into BLT, right? Acquia's build launch tools. Because they have that's integrated with CI and they're already running PHP unit and BHAT testing in there. Could we just add Drutiny as another one of those that happens in the validation step? But what we kind of found was it isn't particularly useful in that step. Like you could get it to fail the build and make the developers kind of go back and do things, but it was just kind of repeating what they were already using in that process. And actually we found it was kind of better to let those tools continue to do their thing and that Drutiny kind of focus on the space where those tools couldn't address the solution.
I'm curious if it does anything with the theme, particularly with like Twig and Drupal 8. Does it, for example, can it find like anti-patterns like, hey, you're rendering this, or not rendering, but you're outputting this data in a way that isn't cacheable, or you're outputting this data in a way that means that it won't pass through the translation layer, or do you kind of just not touch the theme at all?
At the moment, we have something really rudimentary, which is like a code scanning tool. So we use this largely to look for bad uses of code. So a couple of examples of bad uses. So there are just do's and don'ts in Drupal programming, right? Like you're not going to use global variables like post and get super globals, right? And you don't want to make calls to system shell and that sort of stuff in your code. Like if you see that sort of stuff in custom code, that should be sending warning lights about what the customer is building and what they're doing. So we can look for those patterns in the code and start scanning for them. And that's I say it's rudimentary because it's a complex audit that under the hood is just doing a series of like scanning for files and gripping those files for certain patterns, essentially. But it is essentially like a sort of code scanning capability. And we do use it for that. One of the other use cases is when customers are making HTTP calls to third-party services on the Drupal request. When that happens, you kind of turn Drupal into a glorified proxy. Right? It's waiting for a third-party response, and so your performance becomes dependent on that third party's performance. And so we've seen enough customers that run into this problem and have issues on our platform because of it, that we start actively looking for that sort of stuff. So if we find it, we raise it up in the report, and then it gives the opportunity for the technical account manager to have that conversation with customers about, what are they doing there? Is that a problem? Sometimes it's not a problem, but sometimes it is, and it gives us that opportunity to rectify it before it gets to production.
So you mentioned that there's a couple of points in the life cycle of a client's, partnership with Acquia that it's prudent to run this. And you kind of hinted that, it's not something that you just kind of throw in the CI and review once in a while. When are the times, you have the go live, you have the load test. What are some of the major life cycles? Is this something you run when there's an issue, you run monthly, you run when there's migration? What's the kind of, grab bag of times that you run this for clients?
Yeah, so right now we use it at a site review. So we have a profile dedicated for site review. We have a profile dedicated for load analysis. So that could be used whenever customer does load testing, or if they have a traffic event that we want to do deeper analysis into, we can run it, provide the time period for that. We also have periodic reporting where we would like do a traffic analysis over, say, a week period or a month period.
Wait, sorry to interrupt. Are you saying that you can do post analysis for like a traffic event? So it's not something that has to be live because you store logs elsewhere. You can.
It's completely forensic. Yeah. So we do all of our load test analysis forensically because we've got enough data on our platform that you don't need to be there to know what happened. In fact, it's actually better because when you're live monitoring a load test, it's very gut emotional. But when you're looking at it forensically, you can, you know that the event's gone and that the urgency is not there anymore. You can sort of look at it in a clear mind about what the data is and understand and help put the pieces of the picture together.
Wow, that's pretty cool. So what are the times? You said you do kind of a periodic one. You have a go live. You have the load test or load event.
Yeah, mentioned the traffic analysis. We have like a health analysis one as well. So health analysis would be like we look at, again, logging data, but rather than looking at things like hit rates and speed of PHP requests and volume of PHP requests, some of that factors in, but we would also look at things like what's happening in your watchdog log statistically. What sort of errors are cropping up in there that you want to be paying attention to? Can we see any alignment with that in the FPM error log? And is there any detection of internal string buffers? Is your op cache size correct? All that sort of stuff. And many of these sorts of things you can't really know from, say, the code base standpoint. You actually kind of have to let the application operate so you have some data to measure it by. And so really, sorry to interrupt again. So is this the kind of tool that will tell you like, hey, you should increase this value in your MySQL configuration to get better performance, or you need to increase your PHP memory limit? Yeah. So, a really good example of this, right? Acquia has a knowledge base article that tells you how to configure your op cache amount, right? And so it tells you, hey, go looking for these type of logs in your logs. And if you have them, then it's an indication that you don't have enough op cache. And then you should consider raising it, right? That's what the knowledge base article says. So we can write a Drutiny policy that would go into the logs, look for that value. And if it finds it, it would consider the policy a failure, right? Like it reports it as a non-compliant policy. And then we can show the remediation message in the report, which would be increase your buffer. Sean and I had even built in methods in Drutiny to remediate. So we would have like an audit method in the class and then a remediation method in the class so that you could pass in like a -R flag in the command line call and fix things on the fly.
That sounds dangerous.
I just took it out recently because we stopped using it because we were like, inspection's way safer than remediation. But there are sometimes places where you might like to do that.
Yeah, you misconfigure something and all of a sudden you upgrade the OS to experimental and it's like, wait, what happened? Kubernetes upgraded. What are we doing?
Yeah.
I mean, the more I hear about it, the more powerful it sounds, and the more of a tragedy that I hadn't heard about it until last week.
The tragedy is the content piece. So I kind of mentioned this earlier. Like we have a lot of this content in Acquia built up. But it's hard for us to find ways of kind of getting it access for communal use. So we've found value in how to invest in it inside of our organization, and the tool is open source for anybody else who wants to use it. But the archive of content kind of needs to be built, at least either communally or for anybody who wants to kind of leverage it. So today there are a set of YAML files that are underneath. So Drutiny has its own organization on GitHub, so you can go visit there. There's a repository called Drutiny content, and inside there is a collection of YAML files, which is all of the available content that we have today. And what happens is we actually provide that YAML content using GitHub Pages as just straight JSON data. So Drutiny, when you run it locally, will contact GitHub and pull down that JSON data and use that content. So, you can make pull requests to that content to kind of essentially provide more Drutiny policies for people to use communally. That would be the sort of pathway for doing that. But it kind of, for us at Acquia, it kind of lacked content workflow, moderation and the right sort of conversation for us to include and incorporate a wider array of people in the organization. What I mean by that is, GitHub's very geared towards developers, and they're quite comfortable operating and having conversation and workflow using GitHub. But if you wanted to widen your audience, it gets a lot harder to get people on board with using GitHub. Why that's important? We talked about Drutiny having PHP audit classes. Okay, so you need developers to be able to build that. We talked about policies being made up of configuration and of content. And so configuration, again, is something a developer can provide, but someone who's really good at writing an assessment for something may not be as good at communicating that thing to a customer. So we want somebody else to be involved in being able to contribute to the content. And that's the part that kind of fell over for us in the community, was like, how do you kind of put together a really great set of content for the use case that you're for the profile that you're using, and also something that's sort of easy for people to understand. And so we kind of found like policies in particular in Drutiny really required an array of a mixture of different types of people to collaborate together towards producing the content for this tool. Sorry, just to kind of, so what have we done at Acquia? We've built our own Drupal site, and it hosts a Drutiny policy content type and a Drutiny profile content type. And then we expose those content types over Drupal's native APIs, so JSON API. And we built drivers in Drutiny to talk to that site and pull that content down. So we actually use content moderation in Drupal to be able to build all of these different policies and manage them, put them through workflow moderation processes. So we've got people at Acquia who can review those policies and publish them. Although anyone can revise them, only some people can publish them. We've also built in translation support. Drutiny is translation capable. So we're into regions like Portuguese for South America, Japanese in Japan, and also European languages. We've got the ability to translate all of our policies inside of Drupal. Again, something quite difficult to manage as a series of JSON files sitting in GitHub, but something that's quite native and easy to do inside of Drupal. So that's kind of what we've gone ahead and done.
So to make sure I'm clear, if I install Drutiny locally, which I have, and I run it against one of my Drupal sites, when I run a particular profile and I get the report back, the content of that report is being pulled real time from a Drupal database to fill out that content report?
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, that's interesting. Oh, okay.
So there's a 3.x branch, which I've been working on as our sort of latest iteration. It's not currently the default branch of GitHub. I think that's still 2.x, but it has a bunch of, so since 2.x, we've been doing this sort of remote pulling of content. The idea was that you can have multiple sources, right? So you can pull from GitHub, you can have your own personal repositories.
That was going to be my next question.
You can pull from Acquia's ones, and maybe other platform providers decide to open up theirs as well. And everyone, you can just have access to all of them and use the repositories that you like. So in 3.x, I've also built it was previously just using standard caching, like you request it and cache it. Now it uses it more of like a composer package model where it, you do an update or a clear cache that downloads the sort of version locally again, so that you've got a whole set of it. That's more of a performance consideration, but you do actually end up with the full archive of available policies sitting in your local set up.
So it sounds like you've mentioned this a couple of times now, but it sounds like it's an open source tool, but there's been a significant amount of customization for Acquia's specific use case. So one of the questions that always raises for me is that customization like in the Acquia organization, or is that customization in the Drutiny project that we get on GitHub?
It's in both. So an example would be, we needed, as I mentioned earlier, we use Sumo Logic as our log analysis tool. And so we needed integration for Drutiny to talk to Sumo Logic. So I wrote the Sumo Logic driver in Drutiny and released it underneath the Drutiny organization, and that's open source. But we use internally, we needed to support mapping of our a customer's machine name for their application to how we use that machine name inside of our log analysis tool. Yeah. And so I wrote, some private internal integration that maps that and makes it easier for our policies to operate on top of that. And then again, because that tool is not available to our customers directly, there's no point in making the policies that we wrote for that tool available publicly because they wouldn't work for anybody. You'd need API keys to Sumo Logic and that sort of thing. So there's nothing stopping you from, going and getting Sumo Logic turned on for your application. And if you're using Acquia, you can use log forwarding to push those logs into Sumo Logic, and then you could use the Drutiny Sumo Logic driver to talk to Sumo Logic. That's already pre-set up, but then you would need to write your own policies which specified the Sumo Logic queries that you wanted to send over their API and get that information that you wanted back. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, it's always a fine line between closed source and open source stuff. I mean, you don't, sometimes even myself, I'm pretty pro open source. Sometimes it's helpful just to see examples of how those things get integrated, but I'm also realistic. I mean, releasing that kind of stuff is effort in itself because you have to make sure that there's nothing truly private or like any API keys or something leaked. So
and it's also like I talk about policies like it's content, and further proof of that is that in Acquia we store policies as content in Drupal. So that is a significant thing, right? Because if you think about open source in the Drupal paradigm, even the amount of it's basically have the source code for free, but the content, no matter where the Drupal implementation is still essentially proprietary, right? Like people don't share content, they share code. And I think this is sort of the same principle here. Like policies, although we sort of get a sense like some of the stuff could be applicable to people in an open sense, most of it is really most suitable in a specific use case, which for us is Acquia's use case. So we have, even though our policies aren't all on GitHub and in this open repository, we do have like an open API endpoint that is accessible for people. So this Drupal site that I'm talking about, we have the delineation between what we would call private, public, and so you can we still anticipate partners and customers being able to use Drutiny, contact that Acquia endpoint and pull down our content. The only thing that's really closed is your opportunity to participate in maintaining that content, but your access to it is not there.
Yeah.
So, since it sounds like, if you really want to start seeing the full power of Drutiny, you need to kind of develop some integrations. How would you rate kind of the technical expertise required to do that? Is it something that if you're, a junior developer just kind of starting out, you could jump in and you could integrate something fairly simple? Or, is there some higher level?
Drutiny probably suffers from a common symptom of many open source projects in that it has poor documentation. So it's if you're good at sort of looking at and learning from source code, reading source code, then I think that would be okay. Like in terms of like if you wanted to get involved and take a look around, we do have docs. Like if you go to Drutiny.github.io. There's a doc site there. There's a doc site there for version 3, which is drutiny.github.io/Drutiny. It's the latest docs page. But it is quite limited compared to the wealth of capability that sits inside of Drutiny in terms of all of the tools. And 3.x, I've done a lot of work in the tooling side to try and help better self-document or provide better metadata to the users through the command line. So, you can get either it's like the policy info command to get information about the policy profile info command, audit info command, target info command to be able to provide all the insights around what metadata a target provides, what parameters are available on an audit, what does the policy do, what does a profile do. So that sort of stuff is I've tried to broaden the CLI tool set so that it becomes more intuitive in lieu of more comprehensive documentation. But ultimately, if you can read a policy file and understand what it can do, one of the YAML files in the GitHub repo, that would be a great starting point to be able to copy that policy file and create your own one and see if you can get Drupal or Drutiny to audit your Drupal site and look for something a little bit different. In the 3.x branch, there's also a policy download command. So as I mentioned, a lot of these things kind of have it's all hosted somewhere else. So, you can connect to Acquia's repositories and find a policy that we have. And if you want to modify that, you can just call policy download, and then it'll download you a local YAML version of that policy. And then the local file system is a higher priority policy source than the remote ones. So once it's downloaded, it immediately is overridden as the priority policy to inherit. So you can then start mucking around with that locally and modifying it as you wish. So that's good if you want to have overrides from what you're using remotely. And it's also good if you want to sort of base your own policy off of a pre-existing one, because then you can rename it and sort of create a new policy from there.
So what is the best way, anyone listening to this who's interested in giving it a try, what is the best way to get started to use Drutiny and install it? Where do they go? And how hard is it to get installed and running?
Best place to get started would be to head over to GitHub and go to Drutiny/Drutiny. That's the sort of core repository. Drutiny is a plugin-based setup, so there's other composer libraries around to extend it. So you download Drutiny, you're going to get audit classes for HTTP, for Drupal 7 and for Drupal 8, but then you can also plug in like Cloudflare, Sumo Logic, Domo if you have the need to support any of those extra things. I think Amazing might even also have their own plugin as well for their platform. There's also another one for Acquia. Once you have those kind of like plugins, you Composer install it is one option. There's also a FAR file available. So you can just go to the releases page and download the latest FAR file and start using that, so you don't have to go through the Composer installation process. That might be like a good start for using it to audit a Drupal site, seeing how that kind of works. If you wanted to go the next level and started to maybe do a little bit of development yourself or build your own policies, build your own audit class, then you're going to want to use the Composer install method so you have access to the source code. So you'd want to clone that repository down, or maybe start your own Composer project and require Drutiny as a dependency, and you can add in the other plugins, that sort of thing. That's what we do at Acquia. So we have like an Acquia version of it that we would build from. So we clone that repository down. It has the Drutiny set up as a set of dependencies. Composer install that, and then we work from that as our sort of working directory.
Fantastic. If you have questions or feedback about today's show or any other show, you can reach us on Twitter at Talking Drupal, We also have a Talking Drupal channel on Drupal Slack, and you can always email us at show@talkingdrupal.com. We do have a newsletter that comes out with each episode that gives you show notes and usually some additional information on what's going on with Talking Drupal.
You can also promote your Drupal camp on Talking Drupal. Learn more about it at talkingdrupal.com/camp promo.
And thank you to our patrons for supporting us all these years. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and push that become a patron button.
And thank you, Josh, for joining us. This has been a great show. Is there anything that we missed that you'd like to cover? Like to shout out?
I don't think so, Nick. I felt like I've done lots of talking.
If our listeners wanted to reach out to you, had any questions, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, sure. Hit me up. Perhaps the easiest way would be to file an issue on GitHub, on the GitHub project. That's probably the easiest way to get some support. And then that way, it's not just you're waiting on me for a response. You can get some support from the other folks that are contributing in the community. I'm also available on Drupal.org, so you can send me a message through there. My handle is just Josh Waihi, so it should be pretty straightforward to find me.
Sounds good. And Stephen, where can our listeners reach out to you?
It's always easy, StephenCross.com with a PH. And you, Nick.
And you can get me at NixVan, NICXVAN, pretty much everywhere.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. Have a good night, guys.
Thanks, guys.